In the first winter after the Second World War, as the world shifted from hot battlefields into a tense new rivalry, the United States Navy assembled one of the largest polar expeditions ever attempted and pointed it toward the bottom of the world. The mission had a plain official name, the United States Navy Antarctic Developments Program, but it quickly became known by a punchy code word that felt equal parts scientific and secretive: Operation Highjump. It gathered thousands of sailors and airmen, dozens of aircraft, and a flotilla of ships ranging from an aircraft carrier to seaplane tenders, destroyers, tankers, and an icebreaker. At its head stood two admirals whose names were already woven into polar history. Richard E. Byrd, the public face of American exploration, served as the expedition's overall leader, while the task force at sea was commanded by Rear Admiral Richard H. Together they were charged with a daunting list of objectives that blended research, training, and strategy. They were to test men and machines in the most hostile climate on Earth, to photograph and map vast stretches of unmapped coastline and inland ice, to learn how to build runways on snow and keep ships alive in pack ice, and to consider whether permanent bases could be supported in this frozen realm. In the anxious early days of the Cold War, those goals had a strategic edge. The polar regions were increasingly seen as the shortest aerial corridors between continents, a potential avenue for bombers and later missiles. Mastering polar operations meant mastering a frontier that could shape future warfare. Yet the mission was also wrapped in the romance and risk that had always defined exploration. Preparations were furious and fast. The war had filled American shipyards with vessels and aircraft, and the Navy now pressed that experience into an expeditionary shape. Flight crews trained in mountain states for cold weather takeoffs, practiced landings on frozen lakes, and learned the peculiarities of magnetic compasses near the poles where lines of force curved and misbehaved. Engineers stocked cargo holds with tractors, snowplows, sleds, aviation fuel bladders, portable weather stations, emergency rations, and clothes designed to keep men alive in temperatures that could burn exposed skin in minutes. The aircraft list showcased the variety of approaches under consideration. There were twin-engine flying boats designed to set down on open water and skim through spray. There were rugged transport planes fitted with skis and equipped with cameras that could photograph the surface in 3 directions at once for mapping. Helicopters, still relatively new to naval service, were included to test their usefulness in search and rescue and short hops over broken ice. Each aircraft bristled with modifications learned in wartime and adapted for the extreme south: insulation around fuel lines to prevent icing, heaters to keep instruments from freezing, de-icing boots on leading edges, and sometimes small rocket bottles to help heavily loaded planes claw into the thin, cold air. The fleet left the United States in phases and converged on the Southern Ocean as summer returned to Antarctica. The plan divided the armada into groups that would sweep along different sectors of coast and then assemble near the Ross Ice Shelf to establish a temporary base known as Little America. There the expedition would test the most challenging part of its agenda: building a functioning airfield on snow where heavy transports could land, unload, refuel, and fly again. The ships entered a world that looked endless and empty, but was alive with motion. Wind carved grooves across the ice and built pressure ridges as floes collided. The sea could slam shut and trap even an icebreaker if commanders misjudged the weather. Fog could rise without warning and hide bergs the size of buildings. It was a place where a working day might contain sunlight that never set and a night that never ended, where navigation depended as much on dead reckoning and celestial fixes as on unreliable magnetic bearings. When the task force reached the edge of the pack, the crews got to work. Ice pilots and lookouts fanned out to the bow, guiding ships along ribbons of open water and forcing paths where channels narrowed. Seaplane tenders craned flying boats over the side and lowered them onto the gray water to test engines in the cold. From wooden decks came the groan of steel under strain and the steady beat of engines turning through slush. The carrier launched to scout flights during windows of clear weather, and the first photographic missions began. From the air the coast looked like a jagged white knife. Ranges of black mountains thrust through the ice like islands, their tops whipped by streaming snow. Bays lay sealed under sheets of fast ice. Farther inland, the surface climbed gently toward the polar plateau, an almost featureless desert of compressed snow that glowed under low sun. At the Ross Ice Shelf, Sailors and Seabees drove tracked vehicles ashore from landing craft and began cutting a runway into a landscape that swallowed sound. They staked out markers with flags to guide pilots and scraped the surface to a firm blue layer where skis could bite. Wind chill drove workers to pause and pound sensation back into their fingers. Generators were dug into snow pits to shield them from the wind. Cargo tents were anchored with buried dead men instead of stakes. In that alien setting, an airfield grew, and with it the tempo of operations. Ski-equipped transports practiced landings and takeoffs, sometimes boosted by small rocket bottles mounted to the fuselage. Flight crews learned to taxi on snow without digging in, and to judge the tricky balance between weight and lift in air so cold and dense that engines performed differently. Photographic crews checked cameras that shot through bellyports and taught themselves to interpret the endless gradations of white they'd later bring home as maps. Meteorologists released weather balloons and tracked shifting winds. The rhythm of life became the rhythm of weather windows, a scramble of sorties followed by hours of blowing drift, maintenance, and warm-up cycles. Then came the tragedy that stamped itself into every memory of the expedition. A flying boat on a long-range photographic mission encountered a sudden storm near heavily crevassed coast. Snow closed around the aircraft and visibility vanished. In the confusion of swirling white and ice ridges, the pilot attempted to climb clear and the aircraft struck terrain. The impact broke the fuselage and hurled men into a world of jagged ice and wind that tore sound from mouths. Some were killed instantly. The survivors gathered what they could, fought to keep life in one another with shared body heat and improvised shelters, and waited in a wilderness where waiting can be a death sentence. Back at the base, when the plane failed to return, the alarm surged through the chain of command. Search parties launched in every direction. Helicopters probed the storm margins, their rotors clawing at the thin air, and ski planes crisscrossed likely routes in the brief clearings. Days later, against odds, a rescue crew spotted figures waving near the wreck and set down on a patch of tortured snow. They brought out the living and the bodies of the dead. The recovery was a testament to skill, luck, and the stubborn will not to abandon comrades. It also underscored the unforgiving nature of the continent and tempered the expedition's swagger with grief. Despite the loss, the mapping campaign gathered an astonishing harvest. Aircraft ran long photographic lines along coasts that had never been seen from above and stitched together mosaics of mountain chains and glaciers. Photogrammetrists later used the overlapping images to calculate heights and distances, turning pictures into charts. Pilots tested navigation tricks that would later become routine for transpolar flights. They used the sun as a compass when magnets lied, learned to love the reliability of the gyro, and developed procedures for homing on radio beacons planted on the ice. Crews also experimented with aerial supply drops, a technique that would support future polar stations. Parcels packed with fuel, food, and mail fell from low-flying transports to sled parties marked by panels on the snow. Penguins flocked to the fringes of the base, curious and unafraid, while seals sprawled on nearby leads as if the roaring tractors were no more than a new kind of wind. The men traded stories in the mess about mirages that lifted mountains upside down into the sky and about auroras that flowed like green rivers across the night. In quiet moments, some wrote letters home describing a beauty that photographs could not capture. As the season wore on, pack ice tightened and the weather turned fickle. The task force had planned for an extended campaign, but Antarctica likes to have the last word. Pressure ridges rose around the ships like frozen waves. The icebreaker fought a constant battle to keep channels open. Commanders weighed the diminishing margin for error against the remaining goals and chose prudence. Gradually, the groups recalled aircraft, crated equipment, and winched helicopters aboard. The base was secured for the inevitable return of winter. The fleet turned north, leaving behind flagpoles and snowed-in structures that would later be rolled over by the slow motion of the shelf. The return voyage gave sailors time to take stock. They had lost men, learned hard lessons, and proven that large-scale operations were possible on the southern continent, but only with meticulous preparation and respect for nature's veto. In the years that followed, the photographs and reports spread through cartographic offices, research labs, and naval schools. The expedition's mapping significantly refined the outline of the continent and revealed candidate sites for future stations. Its engineering after action notes became a cold weather manual. How to fuel aircraft in sub-zero temperatures without water condensing in lines. how to fit tracked vehicles with cleats that bit without tearing tracks, how to anchor buildings with buried timbers, how to design clothing that layered protection without trapping sweat against skin. The rescue lessons were equally valuable, prompting changes in survival kits, signaling equipment, and training for downed aircrews. Strategists absorbed the operational insights too. If aircraft could stage from snow runways and be serviced in field conditions, permanent bases were conceivable. That conviction became reality less than a decade later when new operations returned to Antarctica to support the International Geophysical Year. Out of that period came year-round stations at McMurdo and the South Pole, and a sustained American presence that would have been unthinkable without what Highjump discovered, tested, and survived. No story about Operation Highjump would be complete without addressing the myths that grew around it. Because the mission was large, fast, and conducted by military units with a taste for radio silence and coded signals, it attracted an aura of mystery. Later writers folded it into tales about lost Nazi strongholds in the southern ice, or about encounters with unidentified craft. Some lifted an ambiguous remark from a foreign interview with Admiral Byrd and framed it as a warning of aerial threats from pole to pole. Those narratives make for thrilling copy, but they wilt when set beside the paperwork, logbooks, and hundreds of first-hand accounts generated by a bureaucracy that recorded everything from engine hours to dental visits. The expedition's tragedies, triumphs, and daily routines are visible in those documents, and they paint a picture not of secret battles, but of the hard slog of exploration. The real story is more human, and, in its way, more impressive. A vast naval task force was repurposed for science and testing on a continent that punishes overconfidence. Men did what they were trained to do, improvised solutions when training fell short, took care of one another in bitter conditions, and came home better at their jobs and richer in respect for the place they had visited. The personalities at the center of the mission also deserve attention. Admiral Byrd, long a symbol of American polar ambition, had evolved from the dashing aviator who made world headlines into a seasoned leader who understood that modern exploration was a team sport. He lent cachet to the mission and navigated the political channels that such a large undertaking required. Admiral Cruzen, commanding the task force, managed the complex choreography of ships and flights with the clarity of a wartime commander. Beneath them were pilots who had flown against submarines and convoys just a year or two earlier and now trained their eyes to read the subtle dangers of Sastrugian whiteouts. There were Seabees who had built airstrips under fire on Pacific Islands and now built them under the invisible fire of the wind. There were cooks who learned to turn the monotony of powdered eggs and tinned meat into morale, and medics who treated frostbite beside men who had trained as surgeons in field hospitals. The expedition was a floating, flying town, and like any town it depended on the invisible competence of ordinary specialists. Technology often steals the spotlight, and rightly so. One of the expedition's quiet revolutions was the proof that helicopters could change polar operations. They ferried people across pressure ridges that would have trapped sledges, scouted leads for the icebreaker, and plucked survivors from terrain where landing a fixed-wing aircraft would have been suicidal. Their endurance and payload were still limited, but their vertical agility saved lives and time. The photographic systems were another leap. Tri-camera arrays recorded wide swaths of surface in crisp detail, and when combined with overlap and precise timing, they created a three-dimensional view of the landscape long before satellites made such images routine. Ground crews learned to maintain cameras in temperatures that tried to turn lubricants into glue and cracked lenses if equipment came in too fast from the cold. Radio and navigation specialists refined procedures for homing on low-power beacons and for orienting when the magnetic needle wandered. Even the clothing and shelter systems represented technology in layers. Windproof shells over insulating wool, double boots that could be dried while inner liners stayed warm, huts designed to be drifted over and still hold their shape. Beyond science and training, Highjump was a cultural moment. Newspapers carried photographs of aircraft skimming over icebergs and of sailors standing at rails in parkas. The expedition fired the imagination of a public that had just come through years of sacrifice and was hungry for proof that exploration and peace had not vanished from national life. For some, Antarctica symbolized a pure frontier where nations might compete in discovery rather than destruction. For others, it looked like a proving ground for the technologies that would define the next conflict. The truth sat somewhere in the middle. The Navy did not hide its interest in cold weather warfare techniques, and the scientists who joined the ships did not hide their excitement at the chance to measure weather patterns and magnetic variations that shaped global understanding. The two ambitions coexisted, sometimes uneasily, in the same mess halls and briefing rooms. One of the most lasting impacts of Highjump was the way it seeded networks of expertise. Officers and enlisted specialists who cut their teeth on the expedition became the cadre that later built and supplied permanent stations. Pilots who learned to read wind lines on sastrugi would later shuttle scientists to the polar plateau. Seabees who figured out how to anchor fuel tanks in Firn would later assemble labs and dormitories that could stand in place for decades. Meteorologists who charted local storms contributed to a body of knowledge that allows today's forecasters to protect flights heading to and from the continent. Even the failures taught lessons that saved time and money later. The loss of the flying boat led to new survival gear standards and to more conservative rules for weather diverts. The struggles with icing taught maintenance crews to preheat certain systems and to schedule engine turns through the night so cold metal would not shrink in seas. As decades passed, Operation Highjump remained a touchstone. For historians, it marked the transition between heroic age expeditions led by a handful of adventurers and modern, industrial-scale programs. For the military, it provided doctrine pages on everything from convoy spacing in ice to fuel consumption curves in sub-zero water. For geographers, it filled blanks on maps with names honoring pilots, ships, and fallen crew. For the public, it offered images that still define how many imagine Antarctica: blue ice cliffs, aircraft shadows sliding across white plains, tiny dots of men in dark parkas beside tractors that looked like toys against the scale of the continent. When permanent stations rose in the following decade, those images shifted from rare to routine, but the first act belonged to Highjump. The mysteries of Antarctica did not end with the expedition. The continent continues to guard secrets under miles of ice, ancient climates trapped in bubbles and ice cores, meteorites preserved like museum pieces on the surface, entire mountain ranges buried and only revealed by radar. The Southern Ocean hides a tangled web of currents that help drive weather around the world. The aurora still paints the sky with ghostly light, and blizzards still erase the horizon with a flick of wind. But the human relationship to those mysteries changed because a generation of sailors and airmen went south in peacetime and learned how to work there. They proved that large-scale logistics were possible, that mapping could be done with rigor, that rescue was achievable even under marginal conditions, and that knowledge won honestly was worth more than rumor and myth. Operation Highjump can be told as a thriller about survival, as a manual about technique, as a chapter in geopolitical competition, or as a meditation on why people chase horizons. In truth, it is all of those at once. It began with the fleet carving channels through a shifting maze of ice and ended with charts, photographs, and experience that outlived every ship in the task force. It carried the romance of Byrd's name and the discipline of Cruzen's command. It mixed grief with triumph and replaced guesswork with procedure. And it offered a kind of promise that even at a moment when the world was dividing into camps and the language of strategy was hardening, there remained room to risk difficult things for the sake of understanding. The men who went south under Operation Highjump did not find hidden cities or impossible machines. They found a continent that demanded humility, teamwork, and patience. They left it a little better known, and they paved the way for science that would, in time, belong to an international community rather than to any single flag. That quiet legacy is perhaps the most remarkable mystery they solved: how to turn the most forbidding place on Earth into a laboratory where nations could compete in curiosity instead of conflict.